March 21, 1987, and the MS Coral Princess sailed through calm Caribbean waters 3 miles off the coast of St. Thomas, carrying 800 passengers on a 7-day cruise that had departed from Miami 4 days earlier. The ship was a mid-sized cruise vessel with 9 decks, multiple restaurants and entertainment venues, and expansive outdoor spaces where passengers gathered to enjoy the tropical sun and ocean views. Emily Carver was 9 years old that Saturday evening. A slender girl with long auburn hair usually worn in a braid, hazel eyes that lit up when she smiled, and a splash of freckles across her nose and cheeks. She wore a turquoise sundress with white sandals and a silver bracelet her grandmother had given her for her birthday, and she carried a disposable camera she'd been using to document every moment of her first cruise vacation. Emily was traveling with her parents, Richard and Susan Carver, from Denver, Colorado, and the family had saved for 2 years to afford this Caribbean cruise celebrating Susan's 40th birthday and Emily's completion of 3rd grade. The evening of March 21st was designated as Caribbean Night, with a special deck party featuring steel drum music, tropical drinks, and a buffet of island-inspired food served on the Lido deck starting at 7 p.m. The Carver family attended the deck party together, and Emily was excited because the cruise director had announced there would be a limbo contest and dance performances she wanted to photograph. At approximately 8:15 p.m., the sun had set and the deck was illuminated by strings of colorful lights, with several hundred passengers enjoying the festivities while the ship maintained its course toward the next port of call. Emily asked her parents if she could go to the railing to take photos of the ocean and sunset colors, and Susan agreed as long as Emily stayed on the Lido deck where they could see her. Richard and Susan stood near the buffet table about 30 feet from the railing, talking with another couple they'd befriended during the cruise, and they could see Emily's turquoise dress clearly among the crowd. Emily walked to the starboard railing and leaned against it taking photos, and several passengers later confirmed seeing her there between 8:15 and 8:25 p.m., standing alone and appearing perfectly content. At 8:30 p.m., Susan looked toward the railing to check on Emily and saw that her daughter was no longer standing where she'd been, and Susan's first thought was that Emily had moved to a different vantage point. "Richard, where's Emily?" Susan asked, scanning the crowd for the turquoise dress, and Richard immediately began walking along the railing looking for their daughter among the hundreds of people on the deck. They searched for 5 minutes before the concern transformed into genuine fear, checking the restrooms and nearby indoor areas, and asking other passengers if they'd seen a 9-year-old girl in a turquoise dress. By 8:40 p.m., Richard had alerted ship security that Emily was missing, and within minutes the ship's crew initiated emergency protocols for a missing passenger, with announcements requesting Emily report to guest services. The announcement was repeated in English, Spanish, and French every 5 minutes while security personnel began a deck-by-deck search, checking all public areas and staff-only zones where a child might have wandered. In approximately 15 minutes, while hundreds of passengers enjoyed a deck party and her parents stood 30 feet away, 9-year-old Emily Carver vanished from the MS Coral Princess without a sound or scream. If this mystery has captured your attention, make sure you're subscribed for more unsolved cases. Hit that like button and comment where you're watching from or what you think happened to Emily. Now let's continue. Captain Henrik Larsson was notified at 8:50 p.m. that a child passenger was unaccounted for, and he immediately ordered a full ship search while reviewing security camera footage from the Lido deck. The footage showed Emily standing at the railing taking photos between 8:16 and 8:23 p.m., and then at 8:24 p.m., she turned away from the railing and walked toward the interior of the deck, but the cameras lost sight of her in the crowd. The next clear footage of that area was at 8:31 p.m., and Emily was no longer visible anywhere on the Lido deck, suggesting she'd either gone inside the ship or had somehow left the deck through one of several exits. Security teams searched every cabin, every public room, every storage area, every staff corridor, and every possible space where a 9-year-old could be hiding or trapped, but they found no trace of Emily. Susan Carver was hysterical by 9:30 p.m., convinced her daughter had somehow fallen overboard, and she kept screaming, "She was right there. She was 30 feet away. How did nobody see what happened?" Richard demanded the ship turn around and search the water where they'd been when Emily disappeared, and Captain Larsson reluctantly agreed to reverse course while notifying the U.S. Coast Guard of a potential overboard situation. By 10 p.m., the Coast Guard had dispatched helicopters and vessels to search the area where the MS Coral Princess had been sailing between 8:15 and 8:40 p.m., and searchlights swept across dark Caribbean waters. The ship's crew interviewed every passenger who'd been on the Lido deck during the party, asking if anyone had seen Emily after 8:24 p.m., when the cameras last captured her turning away from the railing. Several passengers remembered seeing a girl in a turquoise dress, but nobody could recall seeing her actually leave the deck, or noticed anyone interacting with her in a concerning way. The Coast Guard search continued through the night with helicopters equipped with thermal imaging scanning the water's surface, while vessels circled the area where Emily had disappeared using powerful spotlights to search for any sign of the missing girl. The MS Coral Princess remained in the search area with passengers confined to their cabins as crew members conducted a systematic deck-by-deck search that extended into the early morning hours of March 22nd. Every storage room, mechanical space, crew quarter, and locked area was opened and inspected, and the ship's manifest was verified to ensure all crew members were accounted for, and no unauthorized persons were aboard. Captain Larson reviewed security footage from every camera on the ship, tracking Emily's movements from the moment she'd left her parents at 8:15 p.m. until the last clear image of her at 8:24 p.m., turning away from the railing. The footage showed Emily walking into a crowd of passengers near the center of the Lido deck, and then the camera angles and obstruction from people made it impossible to track her movements beyond that point. One camera near the interior entrance to the ship caught a brief glimpse of what might have been a turquoise dress at 8:26 p.m., but the image was too obscured by other passengers to confirm it was Emily. FBI agents based in Puerto Rico were contacted and boarded the ship via Coast Guard helicopter at 3:09 a.m. on March 22nd, immediately taking over the investigation from ship security and treating Emily's disappearance as a potential abduction. Special Agent Marcus Webb interviewed Richard and Susan Carver extensively, asking about Emily's behavior, whether she'd mentioned meeting anyone on the ship, and if there had been any concerning interactions with other passengers or crew. She was having the time of her life, Susan said through tears. She made friends with other kids in the youth program. She loved the food and the shows. There was nothing wrong. She was just happy and excited every single day. Richard insisted that Emily knew not to talk to strangers or go anywhere with adults she didn't know, and she'd always been cautious and obedient about safety rules the family had established. Agent Webb and his team interviewed every crew member who'd been working on the Lido deck during the Caribbean night party, looking for anyone who might have seen Emily or noticed suspicious behavior. A bartender named Miguel Santos reported seeing a man standing near the railing around 8:20 p.m., who seemed to be watching the children playing nearby, and Miguel had thought it odd because the man wasn't with any kids himself. He was maybe 45 or 50 years old, white guy, average height, wearing a tropical shirt and khaki shorts, Miguel described. He had sunglasses even though it was getting dark, and he stood there for maybe 10 minutes just watching. This description was circulated to all crew and passengers with a request for anyone matching it to come forward for questioning, and several men fitting the vague description were interviewed, but none raised red flags. The theory that Emily had fallen overboard was investigated thoroughly despite the ship's railings being 42 inches high, which would be difficult for a 9-year-old to fall over accidentally without climbing or being lifted. Coast Guard divers searched underwater near where the ship had been when Emily disappeared, looking for any sign that she'd gone into the water, but the currents and depth made recovery unlikely if she had fallen. By the afternoon of March 22nd, the official search was scaled back after 18 hours of intensive efforts had produced no evidence that Emily was in the water or hidden anywhere on the ship. The MS Coral Princess was allowed to continue to San Juan, Puerto Rico, where FBI forensic teams would conduct a more thorough search of the vessel, and all passengers and crew would be interviewed before being allowed to disembark. The cruise line issued a statement expressing sympathy for the Carver family and pledging full cooperation with law enforcement, while emphasizing that their ships had extensive safety measures including railings designed to prevent accidental falls. Media coverage began immediately with news outlets reporting on the mysterious disappearance of a child from a cruise ship, and suddenly, Emily Carver's face was on television screens across America. The other passengers who'd been on the Lido deck that night were asked to review their own photos and videos from the party to see if Emily appeared in any of them, potentially providing clues about her movements. Dozens of passengers provided photos and video footage, and FBI analysts spent days reviewing every image looking for Emily or anyone interacting with her, but the material revealed nothing beyond what security cameras had already shown. One passenger's video captured Emily at the railing at 8:22 p.m., taking photos with her disposable camera, and she appeared completely normal and content with no indication of distress or fear. The disposable camera Emily had been carrying was never found despite exhaustive searches of the ship, suggesting she'd still had it with her when she disappeared. But this small detail provided no useful leads. Richard Carver insisted on reviewing every inch of security footage himself, watching his daughter's final visible moments over and over, trying to spot some detail that might explain where she'd gone after walking into that crowd. "There has to be something we're missing," Richard said desperately. 9-year-olds don't just vanish into thin air. Someone on that ship knows what happened to her. Someone saw something. Susan became convinced that Emily had been pushed or thrown overboard by someone, and she demanded the ship be held at port until every single passenger and crew member had been thoroughly investigated and cleared. The FBI conducted background checks on all crew members and found no red flags among the staff, though several had minor criminal histories from years past that were unrelated to children or violent crime. The MS Coral Princess remained docked in San Juan for 5 days, while FBI teams conducted the most thorough search in cruise ship history, using dogs trained to detect human remains and technology to scan hidden spaces. Every passenger was interviewed before being allowed to leave the ship, and those who'd been on the Lido deck during the critical time window received extra scrutiny, with FBI agents asking detailed questions about what they'd seen and who they'd noticed. A couple from Ohio reported that they'd seen a girl matching Emily's description, walking with a man toward the interior of the ship around 8:25 p.m., but they couldn't say definitively if it was Emily, and the man could have been her father. "The girl was in front of him and he had his hand on her shoulder like he was guiding her," the woman explained. "I didn't think anything of it because that's how parents walk with their kids in crowds." The description of the man was frustratingly vague. White, medium build, wearing casual cruise attire, possibly in his 40s or 50s, nothing distinctive enough to identify him among hundreds of male passengers. Richard Carver didn't recall walking with Emily at that time because he'd been near the buffet the entire evening, and he was certain he hadn't moved from that area until they'd realized she was missing. The FBI created a timeline showing every passenger's movements based on cabin keycard access records, but the data only showed when people entered or exited their cabins, not where they went on the ship's public decks. Several crew members had no clear alibis for the time Emily disappeared because they'd been on break or moving between work areas, and each was investigated thoroughly, despite nothing in their backgrounds suggesting capability for harming a child. One crew member named Thomas Brennan, a maintenance worker, raised brief suspicion because he'd been working in a storage area near the Lido deck and had access to restricted zones where a child could potentially be hidden. Brennan's cabin was searched extensively and his background checked thoroughly, but investigators found nothing connecting him to Emily, and his work logs showed he'd been in the engine room during the critical time period. By April 1987, the investigation had stalled with no physical evidence, no credible witnesses to Emily's actual disappearance, and no suspects who couldn't account for their time or had histories suggesting they'd harm a child. The Carver family returned to Denver devastated and angry, convinced that someone on that ship had taken their daughter, but frustrated by the inability of law enforcement to identify who or provide any answers. Richard quit his job as an accountant and dedicated himself to investigating Emily's disappearance, spending hours analyzing cruise ship layouts and safety protocols, looking for explanations that FBI agents might have missed. Susan descended into severe depression and was hospitalized twice in 1987 for suicidal ideation, unable to function knowing her daughter had vanished while standing 30 feet away from her on what was supposed to be a family celebration. The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in 1988, and the broadcast generated thousands of tips from viewers who thought they'd seen Emily at various locations or believed they knew who was responsible. Every tip was investigated by FBI agents who remained assigned to the case, but the leads consistently dissolved into mistaken identity or conspiracy theories, with no factual basis supporting them. The prevailing theory among investigators was that Emily had been pushed or had fallen overboard in a moment when nobody was looking directly at that section of railing, and her body had been carried away by currents. But this theory struggled to explain how a 9-year-old could go over a 42-inch railing without making noise or attracting attention from the hundreds of people on the deck at that time. Another theory suggested Emily had been lured away by someone posing as crew member or telling her that her parents needed her, and this person had taken her to a restricted area where she was killed and hidden. But extensive searches had found no body, no blood evidence, no signs of struggle anywhere on the ship, and disposing of a body undetected on a vessel with 800 people aboard seemed nearly impossible. The cruise line implemented new safety measures, including mandatory wristbands for all children, and increased monitoring of deck areas. But these changes couldn't bring back Emily, or explain what had happened to her. By 1990, the case had gone cold with periodic reviews but no active investigation, and Emily Carver became one of several children who'd vanished from cruise ships over the years, in circumstances that defied explanation. Richard Carver became involved with maritime safety advocacy, pushing for better security cameras and tracking technology on cruise ships, and he testified before Congress about the need for improved protocols. The disposable camera Emily had been carrying was never found, despite it being the only personal item she'd had with her, and its absence suggested someone had taken it, though whether before or after Emily disappeared remained unknown. Susan and Richard's marriage ended in divorce in 1992, both acknowledging that living together meant constant reminders of the daughter they'd lost and the vacation that had destroyed their family. The MS Coral Princess continued operating Caribbean cruises until 1998, when it was sold and refitted, and some crew members reported that the Lido deck had an unsettling feeling, though most attributed this to knowledge of Emily's disappearance. FBI agent Webb kept Emily's case file and periodically reviewed it until his retirement in 2005, and he admitted in interviews that the cruise ship disappearance haunted him because nothing about it made logical sense. A child doesn't vanish from a deck with hundreds of witnesses and multiple cameras without leaving some trace, Webb said. Either we missed something crucial, or something happened that defies the laws of physics and human behavior. The years accumulated slowly for Richard and Susan Carver, with 1987 becoming 1995 and then 2005, and both carried the weight of not knowing what had happened to their daughter during those 15 minutes on a Caribbean cruise ship. Age progression photos were created showing what Emily might look like at 15, then 21, then 30, and these images were distributed through missing persons databases and featured periodically in media coverage of unsolved cases. Richard remarried in 2000 to a woman who understood his obsession with finding answers, and he continued researching cruise ship disappearances, documenting dozens of cases where people had vanished from vessels under mysterious circumstances. He created a website in 2003 dedicated to Emily's case and maritime safety, and the site became a resource for other families who'd lost loved ones on cruise ships, connecting people who shared similar tragedies. Susan never remarried and lived a quiet, isolated life in Colorado, working from home and avoiding social situations that might require explaining what had happened to her daughter, or reliving the trauma of that March evening. The case was revisited multiple times over the decades whenever other children disappeared from cruise ships, or when new investigative techniques became available. But each review ended with the same frustrating conclusion: insufficient evidence. In 2010, advanced video enhancement technology was used to analyze the security footage from the MS Coral Princess, attempting to track Emily's movements more clearly through the crowd. But the limitations of 1987 camera quality defeated the effort. Forensic analysts could confirm Emily had walked away from the railing toward the ship's interior, and they could identify the approximate moment she'd moved out of camera view, but they couldn't determine where she'd gone after that. The man Miguel Santos had described watching children near the railing was never identified despite the description being shown to thousands of people over the years, and he remained one more frustrating mystery within the larger case. Detective James Morrison of the Denver Police Department took a personal interest in Emily's case in 2015 and coordinated with FBI and maritime investigators to conduct a comprehensive review using modern techniques. Morrison tracked down former passengers and crew members from the 1987 cruise, interviewing them decades later to see if time and distance had changed their memories or made them willing to share information they'd withheld. Most had vague memories of the incident and could add nothing new to the investigation, though several mentioned they'd been interviewed by FBI in 1987 and had told everything they knew at the time. One former crew member named Patricia Ellis contacted Morrison in 2016 with information she claimed she'd been afraid to share in 1987, and her account added a disturbing dimension to the case. Patricia said she'd seen a man carrying what appeared to be a sleeping child wrapped in a towel through a crew corridor around 8:40 p.m. on March 21st, and she'd assumed it was a parent taking an exhausted child back to their cabin. But now that I think about it, passengers shouldn't have been in that corridor. It was crew-only access, Patricia explained. And the man was moving quickly, like he didn't want to be seen, which I thought was odd. Patricia couldn't provide a detailed description because she'd only seen the man from behind and the corridor had been dimly lit, but she remembered he'd been wearing khaki shorts and a patterned shirt. Morrison investigated this lead extensively, but 30 years had passed and verifying Patricia's account was impossible, and some questioned whether her memory had been influenced by years of media coverage about Emily's disappearance. The theory that Emily had been sedated or knocked unconscious and carried through crew corridors gained traction among investigators, but without physical evidence or identification of the man Patricia claimed to have seen, it remained speculation. By 2020, Emily would have been 42 years old, possibly with a career and family if she'd somehow survived, though the statistical likelihood seemed impossible after 33 years without any credible sighting. True crime podcasts began featuring Emily's case in the 2010s and 2020s, analyzing the security footage and maritime protocols and proposing theories about what might have happened on that Caribbean cruise deck. Some podcasters suggested Emily had been taken by a passenger who'd been watching her throughout the cruise, someone who'd planned the abduction and had an escape strategy that avoided detection. Others believed Emily's disappearance was a crime of opportunity by a crew member who'd noticed her alone at the railing and had acted impulsively, then disposed of her body in the ocean when the opportunity arose. The most persistent theory remained that Emily had somehow gone overboard, either accidentally or by being pushed, and her body had been lost to the Caribbean currents despite extensive Coast Guard searches. But none of these theories could account for all the evidence or lack thereof, and each explanation created new questions that couldn't be answered without physical proof or eyewitness accounts. Richard Carver died in 2021 at age 76 from heart disease, and his obituary mentioned that he was survived by his missing daughter Emily, whose disappearance he'd investigated until his final days. Susan attended Richard's funeral and spoke briefly about how their daughter's loss had defined both their lives, and how they'd never recovered from that March evening when a family vacation became a nightmare. The website Richard had created remained active, maintained by maritime safety advocates who'd worked with him, and Emily's case continued to be featured alongside other cruise ship disappearances. The FBI maintains Emily's case in their Unsolved Missing Persons database, and her information is cross-referenced whenever unidentified remains are discovered or when similar disappearances occur on cruise ships. But as of today, more than 37 years after Emily Carver walked away from a railing on the Lido deck of the MS Coral Princess, her fate remains completely unknown. By 2024, Emily Carver's disappearance has become one of the most haunting unsolved cases in maritime history, studied by cruise ship safety experts and discussed in forums dedicated to people who vanish without explanation. The security footage of Emily standing at the railing taking photos, appearing content and safe just minutes before she disappeared, has been viewed millions of times online by people trying to understand how a child could vanish so completely. Susan Carver, now 77 and living in a retirement community in Denver, keeps age progression photos of Emily showing what she might look like in her 40s, faces that exist only in computer algorithms and desperate hope. "I still dream about that deck party," Susan told a reporter in 2023. "I see Emily in her turquoise dress walking to the railing, and in my dreams I follow her. I don't let her out of my sight, but then I wake up and remember I did let her go, and she never came back." The case remains open with the FBI, though no active investigation has occurred in years, and Emily's profile sits in databases waiting for a match that has never come despite decades of technological advances. Detective Morrison continues to review the case occasionally in retirement, and he's interviewed dozens of maritime experts trying to understand the mechanics of how someone could disappear from a cruise ship without leaving physical evidence. "The ocean is the perfect crime scene," Morrison says. "No forensics, no body recovery, currents that move evidence hundreds of miles, and if Emily went overboard, she could be anywhere or nowhere by now." But Morrison also acknowledges that the overboard theory has weaknesses, particularly the height of the railings and the number of people on deck who should have heard or seen something if a child had gone over the side. The alternative theories require believing that someone abducted Emily in a crowded public space, moved her through the ship without being seen on security cameras, and either hid her body somewhere it was never found or disposed of it at sea. Both scenarios seem improbable, yet one of them must be true, and the lack of evidence makes determining which is correct impossible after 37 years without breakthrough discoveries. Cruise ship safety protocols have evolved significantly since 1987, with modern vessels featuring better security camera coverage, mandatory tracking technology for all passengers, and stricter access controls for restricted areas. These improvements have been partially inspired by Emily's case and other cruise ship disappearances, though critics argue the industry still doesn't do enough to prevent tragedies or investigate them thoroughly when they occur. The MS Coral Princess was eventually scrapped in 2005, and during the dismantling process, workers searched every hidden space hoping to find remains or evidence related to Emily, but nothing was discovered in the ship's final examination. Former passengers from that 1987 cruise occasionally post online about their memories of the night Emily disappeared, and some admit they've felt guilt for decades about not paying closer attention or noticing something that might have helped. "We were all just enjoying a party," one former passenger wrote. "None of us realized a child was being taken right in front of us, and I think about that a lot. How evil can happen in plain sight, and good people miss it." The turquoise sundress Emily had been wearing became an iconic image in missing persons advocacy, featured on posters and websites dedicated to finding missing children and improving safety protocols. Susan has stated she wants to be cremated when she dies and have her ashes scattered in the Caribbean near where Emily disappeared, so I can be close to where I lost her and maybe find her in whatever comes after this life. The disposable camera Emily had been carrying that contained photos from her cruise vacation was never found, and its absence remains one of the small mysteries within the larger case that has never been explained. Some investigators believe whoever took Emily also took the camera to eliminate potential evidence, while others think it simply went overboard with Emily and was lost to the ocean. True crime communities continue to debate Emily's case online, proposing elaborate theories and analyzing every frame of available footage, but internet speculation cannot create evidence that doesn't exist. The man in the tropical shirt and khaki shorts that Miguel Santos described watching children near the railing was never identified, and whether he was connected to Emily's disappearance or was simply an innocent passenger remains unknown. Patricia Ellis's account of seeing someone carrying a wrapped child through a crew corridor 30 years later raised more questions than answers, and skeptics point out that memory becomes unreliable over decades. The Caribbean waters where Emily disappeared continue to be traveled by thousands of cruise ships, annually carrying millions of passengers, and most people enjoying deck parties have no idea they're sailing near where a 9-year-old vanished. The case stands as a reminder that even with hundreds of witnesses and security technology, people can disappear so completely that decades of investigation cannot determine what happened to them. And it highlights the unique challenges of investigating crimes at sea, where evidence can be washed away, jurisdiction is complicated, and the vast ocean provides countless ways for secrets to remain hidden forever. Susan Carver maintains contact with other families who've lost loved ones on cruise ships, and together they advocate for stronger regulations and better investigation protocols when passengers disappear. Emily's case could have been solved if the ship had better cameras, if there had been tracking technology, if crew access had been more restricted, Susan says. Her disappearance shouldn't be in vain. It should lead to changes that protect other children. But those changes cannot bring Emily back or answer the questions that have haunted her family for 37 years. Where did she go after walking away from that railing? Who took her, or what happened to her? And why has no evidence ever surfaced? Detective Morrison believes someone on that ship knows something they've never shared, either because they were involved or because they saw something they didn't recognize as significant at the time. 800 people were on that cruise, Morrison says. Someone saw something, someone knows something, and I hope before they die they'll come forward and finally tell the truth about what happened to Emily Carver. But as of today, the Caribbean Sea keeps its secrets, and Emily's fate remains one of maritime history's most baffling unsolved mysteries, a case that challenges our understanding of how completely people can vanish. The last confirmed image of Emily Carver shows her at 8:23 p.m. on March 21, 1987, standing at a ship's railing taking photographs, appearing safe and happy, with no indication that in less than 10 minutes she would disappear forever. And somewhere in the vast Caribbean, or in a place no searcher has yet looked, or in memories someone has kept hidden for 37 years, The answer to what happened to Emily Carver that evening may still exist. But until that answer emerges, if it ever does, Emily remains lost at sea. Her disappearance an enduring mystery that reminds us how fragile safety can be, and how quickly joy can transform into unimaginable tragedy. The memorial website dedicated to Emily shows her smiling in family photos from before the cruise. A happy 9-year-old who loved photography and adventure, frozen forever in that moment before everything changed. And every March 21st, Susan Carver stands at the edge of the ocean in Florida, as close as she can get to where she lost her daughter, and she talks to Emily as if her voice might somehow carry across the water and the years. "I'm sorry I looked away," Susan whispers to the waves. "I'm sorry I let you go to that railing alone, and I'll never stop looking for you even though I know you're probably gone because you're my daughter, and I'll love you forever." But the ocean offers no answers, and the mystery of what happened to Emily Carver on a Caribbean cruise deck in 1987 remains unsolved to this day.